mainstream historians have reached a level of cognitive dissonance in the modern age that is reached absolutely insane levels. Let me illustrate this for you. Look at these two houses. If I were to tell you that the house on the left was built in 960 AD and the house on the right was built in 1963 AD, would you believe me? Would you look at me and think, oh wow, this guy is so smart. He has dated these two houses finally. We now finally have real dates for when these two houses were built, and it's so obvious. He's so smart. No! No one is doing that. If I made the claim that these two houses were built 1,000 years apart from one another, you would look at me like I'm insane. You would look at me like I'm crazy. In fact, I'm pretty sure the laws of nature would force you to grab me by the neck and just start choking me out. Just start slapping me. I mean, you would have no choice. You would have no choice by the laws of science and nature to do that to somebody who made such a ridiculous claim. But this kind of a claim is exactly what mainstream historians are making. What we are going to do today is we are going to go over a section of Anatoly Fomenko's chronology book where he outlines one of the major problems that mainstream historians have created for themselves with respect to creating a chronology. He does a good job in saying it, and he brings a bunch of sources up, so I want to just read what he says so that you guys don't think that I'm all schizo. It's not just me saying this stuff, right? Fomenko's got this figured out. But let me show you one more quick example with respect to history before we get into this, because this situation plagues all of mainstream history, and the reality is it plagues alternative historians as well. Because, unfortunately, alternative historians still generally believe in the mainstream chronology, even though the mainstream chronology has precisely almost zero science backing up any of their claims. So here, let's illustrate that. What you see on the screen now is a slide from a historian named Gunnar Heinsohn. Now, unfortunately, he passed away a little bit ago, but he left all of his material behind for us to use. What Gunnar Heinsohn did is he started to put together, or he started to figure out, that the way stratigraphy was being used to explain mainstream chronology was completely garbage. It was wrong. It was absolutely insane. When he started to analyze all of this stuff using science, he started to go through all the dating methodologies. He started picking apart the the stratigraphy that the archaeologists were using, to support the mainstream narrative of ancient Rome in this case. And he was finding that there were major problems. The major problem that he discovered, or I should say at least pointed out, because it's right in front of all of us. I guess you can't really discover it. But what he did is he called out one of the most obvious failings of mainstream history. So if we look at this chart, what we see is he is pointing out what I pointed out at the very beginning of this show with my example of the houses. Basically, what mainstream historians believe is that Romans during the 1st to 3rd century built in a very specific architecture. Then, of course, everything crumbles, falls apart, and there's a magical dark age. And then magically everything starts back up again as if nothing had happened around the 6th century. And once again, all of the exact same style of architecture starts to show up again. And then, of course, that crumbles and falls apart. There's another dark age. And then over there in the 8th to 10th century, we find the exact same architecture spawning again as if nothing had happened. It gets even crazier because, and mainstream historians and archaeologists know this, by the way, they will claim that construction used in the 1st through 3rd century CE, the material from that construction will magically be used for buildings in the 8th and 10th century CE. So basically, what mainstream historians are saying is that there's all these chaotic dark ages, but for some weird reason, civilization collapses and then immediately restarts, collapses again, and then immediately spawns right back up where it left off. And weirdly enough, the people living in the 10th century have no issue finding all kinds of material from the 1st century and using that material in their construction. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. Historians will honestly tell you that the people in the 10th century literally were using ceiling tiles that were made in the 1st century. Really? Right? Nobody's using ceiling tiles. Nobody is using 1,000-year-old ceiling tiles in any of their construction. It's not happening. Nobody's doing that. And the reason why nobody's doing that is because it's stupid. If you still possess the technology to build in the exact same style, with the exact same situation, you are not going to go find 1,000-year-old ceiling tiles for your house. You're not doing that. You're going to go and you are going to make new ones. Because why wouldn't you? The other problem is, do you honestly believe ceiling tiles in that quantity would last for 1,000 years? No, it's ridiculous. Nobody is doing this. But if you believe in the mainstream chronology, this is what you have to believe. This is a ridiculous point of view. There is no such thing as 3 separate Roman empires. A lot of people will have a problem with that, but that's the truth. To make it even worse, when you look at the archaeological layers, what was discovered is that there is not a single site in existence where you find the early Roman Empire underneath the Second Roman Empire, which is then underneath the supposed Third. There is no stratigraphical area on the planet that supports this. So this is a problem. Because what it means is that the physical stratigraphical record doesn't support mainstream chronology, and it does not support mainstream history. And the reality is, it even calls into question how reliable stratigraphy can be used at all with respect to understanding history. The evidence supports only one potential Roman Empire. And then if you can even call it a Roman Empire, that's a whole other, ball of wax that I'm not going to get into on this show. What I wanted to elucidate for all of you is I wanted to show you that there is scientific evidence, archaeological evidence, that disproves the mainstream's version of chronology. Now, the physical evidence really should have been enough. Right? The reality is, once archaeologists started to dig this up and they started kind of finding this situation, this really should have solved the problem. We should not have the problem that we have now. But we do. Why? What the hell is going on? So here's why we still have the issue, even though we have the physical evidence that proves that there's no such thing as this, 1,000-year Roman situation going on. There's no such thing as Dark Ages. None of this happened. And we have the physical evidence for it. There's just nothing there for it. So why does this version of history persist? And the answer is simple. The only reason why anybody still believes in modern day history is because modern day history was developed before archaeology became something that people were doing. So what happened was, in the Middle Ages, our histories, world history, was starting to be written. It was starting to be collated. It was starting to be created. Now, of course, these so-called historians did not have access to archaeology. They were not doing any kind of scientific research. They certainly did not have access to worldwide information that would help them put together any kind of a worldwide historical story. So what these guys started to do is they started to fill in the gaps in history with their own supposition. So now we find a situation to where a lot of the works that were created in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the early Middle Ages, etc., all of those works that are now cited in the modern age You can't trust those because we know for a fact that these guys didn't have the information that they claim to have. Like, it just didn't exist. How could it? Right? They did not have access to worldwide information. They did not have access to the sciences. They were not doing archaeology. They were simply doing what they thought they should do. And then, of course, you can throw in the whole situation to where people are corrupt and people are paying and bribing for certain aspects of history to exist or be changed or deleted, et cetera, et cetera. And then after a few centuries of that going on, we wind up with mainstream history today. The problem is that nobody questions this anymore. Modern day historians take all of these works now at face value and they believe that they are real. Don't mind the fact that other academics have proven that a lot of this stuff is false, forgery, lies, etc. But the mainstream continues to essentially ignore all of that. And the reason why is simple, right? They have a ready-made history right there, and it becomes really difficult to disprove it because the people who wrote this stuff, they're dead, they're gone. There's nothing to defend anymore. To make it even worse, it's a few centuries old now. So mainstream historians can make the excuse of something like, well, they were closer to the history, so they must have had access to things we don't now. And they're right, they did, they would have. And that's a whole other discussion, which really doesn't help mainstream historians either. But on the whole, there has been great scholarship that has gone to great lengths that has disproven many of the works that are cited in the modern age. But historians don't care, right? The modern historian is so disconnected from the original version of history that they just don't have any reason to change anything because it has been like this for as long as they have been alive. And that matters. Like, that's a whole psychological situation. It's a social, psychological situation. And of course, the power structure that right now runs the planet, I know, without getting crazy conspiracy, I know. But anyways, the point is that there are power structures which objectively promote this stuff. It's right there. That's a scientific fact. There's no way around that. You can't argue that. And of course, those power structures are benefiting from the maintaining of this particular chronology. So, of course, it gets weird for the person who is staying objective and they're looking at the truth and they're looking at the evidence, and of course they come out thinking, well, what the hell's going on? Mainstream chronology is objectively wrong. What the hell are these historians doing? Well, these historians are trusting all kinds of these books that were written during the Middle Ages. So I'm going to go over to Fomenko now. Let's read a little section out of his book, and let's see what he has to say about this particular topic. This section is called
The Problem in Dating the Ancient Sources. Tacitus and Poggio, Cicero and Barzizza, Vitruvius and Alberti.
The framework of the global Scaligerrian chronology was constructed as a result of the analysis of the chronological indications given by the ancient sources. It is natural that the issue of their origin should be of interest in this respect. Modern historiography manifests the paucity of evidence in what concerns the genesis of such ancient manuscripts. The general observation is made that the overwhelming majority of these documents surfaced during the Renaissance epoch that allegedly superseded the Dark Ages. The discovery of the manuscripts often happened under circumstances that forbade the analysis which could allow the critical dating of such findings. And that's actually still a problem that we have today. For example, what I mean by that is that right now you're a historian. I don't care what anybody says. If you're learning history, if you're trying to solve the problem of what's going on in history, you're a historian. So you should be allowed to have access to all kinds of artifacts, and you should be allowed to test them. Yeah, go try to grab any of these original artifacts from any museum everywhere and try to do any actual academic study on them. You won't be allowed to. You are not allowed to touch them. That is not how science is done. But that is what happens in the modern time. So basically what they're saying is that they've already figured it out. You don't have to go question their supposed science. Just sit there, shut up, and believe them. That's how history is done nowadays. Is that how we're supposed to do science? No, that's not how that stuff is done. So even back then, the same thing that happens now happened back then as well. It's a huge problem in history. Okay. In the 19th century, two prominent historians, Hochart and Ross, had published the results of their research proving that the famous quote-unquote ancient Roman history by Cornelius Tacitus was really written by the well-known Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini. The publications occurred in the years 1882 to 1885 and 1878. We should note just that we deem the history by Tacitus to be an edited original. That is a partial forgery and not a complete one. However, the events related in the history have been misstated and transposed far back in time. What he's saying there, one of the other problems in history is that when we look at a lot of these works that were coming out of the Middle Ages, it's not just that there are forgeries, lies, all that stuff. But what also happened was that some of those books may have actually recorded real events. It's just that a completely different date was ascribed to the event. So, nowadays, what does a modern historian do with somebody back in the day that was misstating an actual real event, right? So things get even more crazy. The history of the discovery of Tacitus's books really provokes a great many questions. It was Poggio who had discovered and published the opuses of Quintilian, Valerius Flaccus, Ausonius Pedianus, Nonius Marcellus, Probus, and some tractates by Cicero, Lucretius, Petronius, Plautius, Tertullian, Marcellinus, Calpurnia Seculus, etc. The circumstances of these discoveries and their datings have never been related in detail. Basically, what Poggio was doing, and I don't know if he's going to talk about it, but Poggio was constantly finding magical books that people were paying money for. So, for example, the tractates by Cicero, he just magically finds tractates by Cicero, all of these letters, and he's like, oh yeah, here you go. Here's all these amazing Cicero letters. Yeah, that'll be 800 ducats, please. Yeah, and that's what was happening. He was doing, remember, during this period of time, there was literally an industry created around creating history. So it gets weird. It's weird that this guy has all of this. And then, of course, when other historians wanted to see the originals, he never had them. They were gone. They never existed. He only ever had the copies that he made. Yeah, okay. So you see, that's what history is based on. Anyway. In the 15th century, famous humanists such as Manuel Chrysoloras, Gemisto Platon, Bessarion of Nicaea, and some others came to Italy. They were the first ones to familiarize Europe with the achievements of quote-unquote ancient Greek thought. Remember, Platon is probably the real person who wrote Plato. So that's a whole other situation. All right. Byzantium gave the West almost all of the known ancient Greek manuscripts. Otto Neugebauer wrote that, quote, "The major part of the manuscripts that our knowledge of the Greek science is based upon consists of Byzantine copies made 500 to 1500 years after the death of their authors," unquote. Yeah, how do you like that? But that quote right there really does illustrate what we find in history all over the place. Really, all of these tomes that are claimed to be originals or claimed to be copies of originals, can you really trust that? Even if there was any kind of honesty here, even if some of these books were legitimately copied, do you honestly believe after 1,500 years and according to mainstream history, all kinds of chaotic dark ages, do you honestly believe that these books would have been faithfully translated over the centuries and the millennia? No, it's just not happening. There is no reason to believe any of that, and of course, we have no proof of it either. Right? It's a ridiculous claim made by mainstream historians. It really is. Anyway. According to the Scaligerrian history, the entire, quote, classical ancient, unquote, literature only surfaced during the Renaissance. In most cases, the detailed analysis shows us that the obscurity of the literature's origins and the lack of documentation concerning its passage through the so-called Dark Ages leads one to suspect that none of these texts really existed before the dawn of the Renaissance. Yeah, there you go, right there. For instance, the oldest copies of the so-called incomplete collection of Cicero's texts are said to be the copies allegedly made in the 9th and 10th century AD. However, one instantly finds out that the archetype of the incomplete collection had, quote,
had perished a long time ago,
unquote. The 14th through 15th century witness a surge of interest in Cicero. So, quote, finally, about 1420, the Milanese professor Gasparino Barzizza decided to undertake a rather precarious endeavor of filling the gaps in the incomplete collection with his own writings for the sake of consequentiality. However, before he could finish this volume of work, a miracle occurred. A forlorn manuscript with the complete text of all the rhetorical works of Cicero's becomes unearthed in a parochial Italian town by the name of Lodi. Barzizza and his students eagerly embrace the new discovery, arduously decipher its ancient script, and finally produce a readable copy. Subsequent copies constitute the actual, quote, complete collection, unquote. Meanwhile, the irrecoverable happens. The archetype of the collection, the manuscript of Lodi, becomes abandoned, since no one wants to confront the textual difficulties it presents, and finally gets sent back to Lodi, where it disappears without a trace. Nothing is known of what happened to the manuscript since 1428. The European philologists still lament the loss, unquote. So that quote really does epitomize all of the problems that we basically find with history during this period of time. You know, when anybody wants to go find something, when anybody wants to go prove something, when anybody wants to go and test something, it just disappears, right? The original never exists. And it never exists. That's one of the that is one of the constant themes that you always find during the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the early medieval period. You always find this. Everybody claims to have the original in their basement, but then when real historians ask for the original so they can just double check and make sure that the copy is accurate. My house burned down yesterday. I can't find it anymore. All of those documents are now gone. Like every time, literally every time. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Carrying on. A propos, The reverse, or so-called Arabic reading of the name Barziza, gives TSTSRB without vocalizations, which is close to the consonant root of the name Cicero, TSTSR. The figures 1.28 and 1.29, which will be on the screen at some point, show two ancient miniatures from a book by Cicero that was allegedly published in the late 15th century. In figure 1.28, Cicero is portrayed from the left, writing the tractate on the old age. In figure 1.29, Cicero is depicted from the right side, penning out the tractate on friendship. We see a typically medieval setting. Cicero and his interlocutors are wearing medieval clothes, which means that the author of the miniatures in the 15th century or later apparently didn't doubt Cicero to have been his historical contemporary. For those of you who are not familiar with Cicero, Cicero was a guy that essentially existed, around the early BC era. Right now, mainstream has him being born around January 3rd, 106 BC. So you can see where this guy was supposedly supposed to be writing from. So what Fomenko just said there is that the people who are talking about Cicero, they or not just talking about him, but painting pictures of him, they don't believe that he is some, weird BC era Roman dude. They honestly believe that he is their contemporary or very close to them. They do not think he is some old Roman, right? He was, in their eyes, he was a medieval person. So what that means is that mainstream is wrong. Right there. Nobody was depicting Cicero as some kind of a weird ancient Roman. That is a modern conclusion. The people who were talking about Cicero during this period honestly believed that Cicero was their contemporary. So you can see how messed up modern history is. Because modern history is taking some guy that medieval people honestly believed was living side by side with them, and modern historians take him and they throw him back thousands of years. They just throw him back there. Right? Why do they do that? Right? They do that because of the way mainstream chronology handles situations like this. Now, there's a bunch of weird gray areas that come with this problem as well. It's funny, but think about it. Who is probably going to have a more accurate portrayal of Cicero? Historians in the year 2000 plus, or historians who lived 500, 600, 700 years ago? Who is going to have perhaps a better idea of what the truth is? Yeah, it's going to be the people who lived 700 years ago. They are, regardless, even if he was some kind of a crazy Roman dude, which he's not, but even if he was, they are still closer to him, which means that they probably still would have had better information than we do today. So who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust the mainstream, or are you going to trust the people back in the day who may have actually been living with the dude, who painted the guy as they literally, physically, right in front of them saw him? Right? Who are you going to trust? Okay, anyway, here, let's keep going. I know this whole thing gets weird, so let's see what Fomenko has to say so I don't spoil anything. Okay. De Vita 12 Caesarium by Caius Suetonius is also only available as relatively recent copies. All of them hail back to the only ancient manuscript that is presumed to have been in Einhard's possession in the alleged year 818 AD. His Vita Corelli Magni is supposed to represent a diligent copy of the biographical schemes of Suetonius today. The original document, known as the Fulda manuscript, did not reach our time, and neither did the first copies. The oldest of Suetonius's copies is hypothetically the 9th century text that was only brought to light in the 16th century. Other copies are dated as post 11th century in the Scaligerine chronology. The fragments from De Viris Illustribus by Suetonius is also appearing very late. The alleged dating of the latest fragment is the 9th century AD. Quote, "This manuscript was discovered by Poggio Bracciolini in Germany in 1425. The Hirschfeld manuscript did not survive. Nothing but several pages from the Tacitus part remained. But about 20 of its copies did. These were made in Italy in the 15th century." Unquote. The dating of the ancient sources was performed in the 16th and 17th century out of considerations that are perfectly nebulous to us today. Basically, we have no idea where they were getting their information from. And that's another problem. Like, where were these medieval authors getting any of their information from? Like I said, nobody was doing archaeology. Nobody had any access to any kind of worldwide information. Nobody was doing any science to test the dates of any of this stuff. So why the hell would we believe anything any of these people say? And don't forget, the dating system that we use today was brand new to some of those people, depending on which century we're looking at. So even the dating situation is still going to be messed up, because there would have been areas in these towns and cities and villages to where people would have been writing using all kinds of dating methodologies. So how do we know what's real? We have no idea. Like, that's the issue. This is why it is impossible to believe mainstream chronology. You can't do it. There's nothing backing it up. It's crazy. Okay, all right. De Architectura by Vitruvius was discovered as late as 1497, according to N.A. Morozov. The astronomical part of the book quotes the periods of the heliocentric planetary circulations with the utmost precision. For those of you who are not familiar with Vitruvius, basically this dude lived in the very early 1st century BC. So if his writings are legit, and these people actually had his writings in the Middle Ages, what this means is that even as early as the 1st century BC, people already understood planetary motions. They already realized that the Earth was revolving around the sun. Like, that was done. So this is one of those problems in history that historians have no explanation for. They just ignore it. Right? Because they can't say, but wait a second. Because, okay, mainstream historians try to act like everybody was stupid monkeys back during this period of time. Everybody thought that the entire universe revolved around the sun. Blah, blah, blah. That's the way they look at it. But we have all kinds of books like this which say otherwise. So this brings up an interesting problem. If it's a BC era book or a BC era writing, does that mean that they already had this figured out? Or is this book a medieval book in origin? Because if it is, we would expect them to understand around this period of time about the heliocentric orbits. So this is the conundrum that mainstream historians completely ignore. And it's a conundrum that most people don't even know is a problem. Right? But you got to answer this question. So if you believe, or whoever, if anybody believes in the mainstream chronology, somehow you've got to get around this. They have to get around this problem. And you bring this up, and it's hilarious to watch people stutter. Like, they just stumble over themselves. Because in the first place, they did not even know it was a problem. Okay? And then when they find out that, oh, crap, it is a problem, they have no answer for it. Right? What is their response? Their response is nothing. They have nothing. Because there's just nothing they can say about it. Because what it does is that it immediately destroys one of the foundations of the mainstream chronological version of history. It just goes away. Okay. Vitruvius, an architect who is supposed to have lived in the 1st to 2nd century AD. Oh, that's interesting that he thinks it lives there. So if you go and you look on, mainstream Wikipedia garbage, they have him living around the 1st century BC. Huh, that's interesting. I wonder when that changed. Okay, well, there you go, right? We have people believing different dates already in the mainstream. Okay, and I'm not sure where Fomenko gets that. I'm sure he had some other source that placed, Vitruvius in that period of time. Anyways, it doesn't matter. The point still stands. Although the point is also made even clearer here that we have no idea what's going on with dates. Okay, anyway. All right, so he knew about the heliocentric planetary circulations with the utmost precision. Vitruvius, an architect who is supposed to live in the 1st to 2nd century AD, knew these periods better than Copernicus the astronomer. And that's the key problem. And that's kind of the point I was making a second ago. Because basically, this makes Copernicus's supposed discoveries completely pointless. Because apparently it was already known. It was done. It had already been figured out. And of course, if we look at real history, it had already been figured out. And of course, everything was quite a bit different before all of that astronomically. But I digress. But anyways, that's the problem that a historian runs into. Basically, Copernicus gets credit for learning or figuring out some of this stuff as the first person to ever really do it. However, apparently it was already done way earlier before he ever existed. So now mainstream history has a problem. Anyway. Furthermore, his error in what concerns the circulation of Saturn differs from the modern value of the period by a ratio of 0.000007. The error ratio for Mars is 0.006, and a mere 0.003 for Jupiter. Okay, so check this out as a side note. These guys who were technically living in the Middle Ages, they would have been like 3 or 4 centuries coming out of what the zero event cataclysm had done to them. So at this point in time, the solar system would have essentially settled into the positions that we see today. What that also means is that some of those people back then probably still had access to certain bits of knowledge, calculation capabilities, etc., to where they were able to still accurately track planets and stars, and they were able to calculate the new orbits that all of the planets had essentially reached at this period of time in history. Yeah, check that out. So that flows perfectly. Oh, geez. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's keep moving. See, you always learn something new, like every day. I love it. Okay. We should mark the magniloquent parallels between the books of the ancient Vitruvius and those of Alberti, the prominent humanist of the 15th century. One cannot fail to notice a certain semblance of the names Alb, Verti, and Vitruvius, bearing in mind the frequent inflection of the sounds B and V. I wonder if he gets into this, but that's actually a very important thing to keep in mind whenever you're reading ancient texts or translations of ancient texts or copies of ancient texts. The way people speak matters. The way people pronounce letters matters. And so these things can get written differently as people hear the way that they're spoken. So, for example, he talks about the inflection differences of B, as in boy, and V, as in Vitruvius. Right? Even in the modern ages, right, we know that we can mishear that sound. So, of course, this exact same thing was happening back in the day as well. And that would be translated into copies, and that would screw up names, and that would screw up writings. It happened all over the place. Okay, anyway. Alberti, who lived from 1414 to 1472 AD, is known as a prominent architect, the author of the fundamental theory of architecture that is very similar to the theory of the ancient Vitruvius. As well as the ancient Vitruvius, the medieval Alberti was the author of a voluminous tractate that included mathematical, optical, and mechanical knowledge, as well as from his theory of architecture. The title of the medieval opus of Alberti's, The 10 Books on Architecture, coincides with its ancient analog by Vitruvius. Nowadays, it is supposed that the ancient Vitruvius had been his ultimate ideal that he emulated in the creation of his tractate. And you could see that, right? There's nothing necessarily weird about that. What if Alberti had found Vitruvius? Nobody really know who Vitruvius was. And it's not that Alberti was stealing Vitruvius's stuff, he was just inspired. And so, of course, his inspiration would take from that original source material. Right? So you have to deal with that kind of stuff as well, or at least those possibilities. That's probably not what happened here, or not at all what happened here, but that is something to keep in mind. It's actually a really good point. Alberti's volume is written in an archaic manner, accordingly. The specialists have long ago compiled tables comparing fragments of the works by Alberti and Vitruvius, which sometimes coincide word for word. Historians explain this fact in the following manner, quote, "All of these numerous parallels unveil the Hellenistic Roman atmosphere that his thoughts evolved in," unquote. Yeah, that highlights a very interesting cope mechanism that mainstream historians use. So one of the problems that we find in history when we look at the medieval period is we find a very strong Greek and Roman influence. That's what mainstream historians would say during this period of time. The reason why they say that is because there's so much evidence that shows a lot of the Greek architecture, the supposed Roman architecture and works and all of this stuff was actually done in the Middle Ages, but your historian, your mainstream historian, can't admit that. They can't say that all of that stuff was done in the Middle Ages because they believe in some kind of mythical ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So what they have to say is, they say something like, oh, these guys in the Middle Ages just randomly decided to start emulating cultures from 1,000 years ago or 1,800 years ago. Like, what? What the fuck? Who does? Nobody does that. No one on the planet does that. But this is what the mainstream historians have to say, or they have to believe, to make mainstream chronology work. Right? It's a pure coping mechanism. Okay, let's move on. So, the book of the ancient Vitruvius fits into the medieval atmosphere and ideology of the 15th century AD absolutely organically. Yeah, there it is. Furthermore, the majority of Alberti's medieval constructions are, quote, an emulation of the ancient style, unquote. Yeah, see, there it is. This is the excuses that historians have to make. Right? There's no such thing as ancient Rome or ancient Greece. All of that supposed ancient Rome and ancient Greek crap, that all was created during the Middle Ages. All of it. Yeah, okay. He creates a palace, quote, made to resemble a Roman amphitheater in its entirety, unquote. Yeah, I'm sure he did. I'm sure he was trying to resemble some magical culture in the past. Yeah, right. So, the leading medieval architect fills Italian towns with, quote, ancient, unquote, edifices that are nowadays considered an emulation of the classical age. But this by no means implies they were considered as such in the 15th century. And that's also an amazing point. Remember, the people during the medieval ages never looked at all of these, Greek and Roman buildings and ever thought they were thousands of years old. Nobody thought like that. Nobody writes like that. And the reason why is because they're all contemporary. Right? Throwing all of those buildings, those stone structures, etc., into the past, that's a modern conception. or at least for some of them. It gets a little weird because there were buildings that pre-existed, but those would be covered over by the zero event. Right? So these people, it's not that they discover anything, they just continue to build in the style that they were essentially already building in. But they're doing it at a lesser level because the zero event catastrophe had taken out enough of the areas of the planet to set people back. Right? So, that makes sense. Okay. The books are also written in the manner that will be made archaic much later. It is only after all of this, in 1497 AD, that the book of the, quote, ancient architect Vitruvius, unquote, appears, occasionally coinciding with a similar book of the medieval Alberti, word for word. One feels that the architects of the 14th and 15th century did not consider their endeavors to be an emulation of the classical age. They were the classical age. The emulation theory was not to evolve until much later, in the works of the Scaligerite historians who were forced to explain the numerous parallels between the classical age and the Middle Ages. So he says it right there. The reality is, all of that supposed ancient Greek and Roman garbage, that's all medieval. All of that stuff was built, between 1200 AD to like 1600 AD, or maybe a little less than that. And I know that's weird for a lot of people. That sounds crazy initially, but there's a lot of science that proves that. All right, and we've probably talked about it. We'll talk about it later. Let's keep going. One observes a similar situation with the scientific literature. It would be expedient to remind the reader of how the acquaintance of the European scientists with the works of Euclid, Archimedes, and Apollonius occurred, since, as we can see, the Middle Ages were the time when the, quote, revival, unquote, of the achievements of ancient science took place. M.Y. Vygotsky, an expert in the history of science, writes that, quote, not a single solitary copy of Euclid's Elements had reached our times. The oldest manuscript we know of is a copy made in 888. There is a large number of manuscripts that belong to the 10th through 13th century, unquote. Figure 1.31 shows a page from the deluxe edition of Euclid's Geometry dated in 1457, and I'll post it up there. It contains a picture of a panoramic view of Rome. It is remarkable that the book by the, quote, ancient Euclid contains a picture of the medieval Rome and not the ancient one. One can clearly see a Christian Gothic cathedral right in front. The commentators say that, quote, such Christian monuments as Ercole are depicted here, unquote. One gets a clear implication that Euclid was really a medieval author. I.G. Bashmokova, an expert in the history of mathematics, informs us that even before the publication of Latin translation of the Arithmetica by the, quote, ancient Diophantus, the European scientists have been using the algebraic methods of Diophantus, remaining unaware of his works. I.G. Baskova assesses the situation as somewhat paradoxical. Yeah, that's one way to put it. The first edition of the Arithmetica is dated to 1575 AD. If Ptolemy's Almagest was instantaneously continued by Copernicus, let us remind the reader that the surge of interest in the Almagest publication immediately preceded the era of Copernicus. Diophantus' opus must have been continued by Fomenko. The history of both manuscripts and printed editions of the ancient Archimedes follows the pattern already known to us. According to I.N. Veselovsky, all of the modern editions of Archimedes have been based on the lost manuscript of the 15th century and on the Constantinople palimpsest that was found as late as 1907. It is assumed that the first manuscripts of Archimedes reached Europe quite late, in 1204. The first translation is supposed to have been made in 1269, and the complete text not found until 1884, not until the 19th century. How insane is that? That is absolutely mind-boggling. The first printed edition allegedly appeared in 1503, and the first Greek edition only in 1544. The, quote, works of Archimedes entered scientific circulation after that, unquote. On figure 1.32, you can see an ancient portrait of Archimedes from his book Opera, dating to the alleged 15th century. We see a typical medieval scientist in his study. The commentators couldn't fail to have marked this. Quote, "The study is represented in the Renaissance fashion." Unquote. I guess I should have said something a little earlier, but for those of you who are not familiar with Archimedes, Archimedes is said to have lived in the 200s BC era. So the fact that his works don't show up until 1200s and that aren't completely known until the 18... I mean, that's mind-boggling. That's absolutely insane. Right? So none of this works. Even worse, the people who know about Archimedes are depicting him in a medieval setting. Now, mainstream historians will make stupid claims like, oh, this is just an anachronistic situation. They just decided to paint all these old people in a medieval setting. We have no proof that any of that is true. None. Zero. Zilch. There is no reason to believe that. Nobody was doing that. It makes much more sense to believe that people were depicting Archimedes as a medieval scholar because he is a medieval scholar. That's how simple this is. You do not need to jump through any kind of mental hoops. You don't have to make any excuses. You do not have to use any mainstream coping mechanisms. You can literally just believe what is right in front of your eyes. The evidence is right there. All right, we'll move on. Conical sections by the ancient Apollonius was not published until 1537. Quote, Kepler, who was the first to discover the significance of conical sections, or ellipses, in astronomy, didn't live to see the publication of the complete works of Apollonius. The next 3 books were first published in a Latin translation, a translation yet again, in 1631, unquote. So, the body of work of the ancient Apollonius only got to be published in its entirety after the discovery of the objects that this ancient tractate deals with in Kepler's epic. By the way, could the works of the, quote, the ancient Apollonius, unquote, just be an edited version of the Pole Copernicus? The name Apollonius is almost identical to Paulinus, a Pole, a native of Poland or Polania. The astronomer Copernicus, who lived between 1473 and 1543, was the immediate precursor of the astronomer Kepler. So there it is. That ends this section. But isn't that amazing? All of these books that are by the mainstream given credit to have been written back in the BC era, you know, when we look at the Middle Ages and we look at when these writings start to appear and in the context that they are appearing in and are being discovered in, everything starts to fall apart. The entire mainstream version of history really does not hold up to any scrutiny. The entire version of mainstream history does not hold up to any real scrutiny whatsoever. So Fomenko just outlined a few really good areas that proves that at the very least, there are some serious discrepancies with respect to our current understanding of history. Now, if you look at the situation objectively, what this means is that you can basically get rid of all of mainstream chronology. Now, at first, I realize that that is going to scare people. Because, of course, we have all, in the West anyway, we have all grown up with this very particular chronology. And everybody just knows it's true. And the reason why everybody knows that the mainstream chronology is true is not because anybody did any real scholarship. It's not because anybody applied the scientific method. It's only because you have been told that it is true. And that's it. Right? And that might sound harsh, but it's something, breaking out of, getting rid of mainstream chronology, I can't stress it enough. Like, it has to be done. If you are not getting away from mainstream chronology, you will never make any discoveries in history. Because any discovery that you might make, that you then go and try to force fit into a false chronology, you're never going to get anything out of that. Your discovery will never make sense. That's one of the problems that we have right now with respect to archaeology. These guys keep finding all these crazy artifacts, and when they go to date it, they don't just look at the objective evidence. They go to a historian, and they ask the historian who believes in the modern chronology to date that artifact. And of course, the modern historian is going to absolutely misdate that artifact, in which case, then the archaeologist is going to completely misdate his entire archaeological site. And then, of course, this just keeps snowballing. From a scientific perspective, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe in mainstream chronology.